And David, take it away.
Okay. I'll make a few introductory remarks that will give others a chance to arrive. I'd like to thank Patrick and our board members for hosting the program today, and welcome to our working group members and guests today for our panel discussion, as we're attempting to better understand the consequences of High Representative Schmidt's October 2nd decisions relative to the election law. We look forward to presentations by our esteemed panelists as we consider ways to respond effectively to the High Representative's recent decisions. I will introduce our panelists, Bojan, Šošić, Azra Zornić, and Parliament member Tineke, Strik, and following their introductory comments, we'll open for questions, and you can, if you have questions, you can send them in the chat to myself or to Patrick McCarthy, or raise your hand. And before beginning our program, in case you're new to the meeting, I wanted to briefly introduce the Working Group for Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as some of our previous efforts in opposition to the High Representative's decisions related to election reform. The Working Group for Bosnia and Herzegovina is a volunteer association of Bosnian American leaders and allies committed to peace and justice in a secure, united, and civic-based democratic Bosnia and Herzegovina. To this end, we engage in public advocacy of policies that support these goals. Our specific goals include raising awareness about the genocide from 1992 to 1995, resisting genocide denial and the glorification of war criminals, and advocating for the right of memorialization for victims, and constitutional reform in alignment with EU standards and decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. In terms of today's discussion, our group has publicized our opposition to the decisions that were recently imposed, my apologies. For example, already in October 2021, we wrote to High Representative Schmidt on this same issue, so it was just over a year ago, to protest and warn of lobbying from Croatia for a so-called legitimate Bosnian Croat representative or member of the presidency. We warned that such lobbying, which had been supported by the Russian Federation, sought to undermine Bosnia's sovereignty, and we appealed to the High Representative to reject ethnic divisions of constituent peoples and uphold the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. Then, at a press conference in July, in which I participated as a member of the working group, along with Bojan, Azra, and others, we raised our voices against the then anticipated election reform. We asserted that it was incomprehensible that the High Representative would use his bond powers to further reinforce discrimination rather than upholding the European Court of Human Rights decisions, and would bring about a form of apartheid that would undermine Bosnia's case for EU membership. His planned decision at that time would have primarily benefited HDZ and SNSD, who have sought to undermine the sovereignty of Bosnia, serving the interests of Serbia and Croatia, and it would have been an unconscionable act of appeasement and a completion of genocidal goals from the 90s. Finally, in a media release 2 weeks ago, following the October 2nd decision, I asserted that as the US, EU, and NATO continue to respond resolutely to aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine, seeking to defeat the ideology of the Russian world and to prosecute the Russian Federation for war crimes, so they must counter efforts by Serbia, Republika Srpska, and Croatia to undermine Bosnian sovereignty. And it's incumbent upon the High Representative and the international community to support, in opposition to Russian, Croatian, and Serbian worlds, a democratic world in Bosnia in a way that responds to voices of citizens who have been demanding the right to a civil state in a way that moves Bosnia ever closer to EU and NATO membership. And I also raised a concern about a little known May 2022 memorandum of the Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts, which is hauntingly similar to the SANU memorandum of 1986, in which this Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts calls for legitimate Croat representation at all costs, at any cost, and also a third entity. So our group, collectively and its individual members, were protesting before and after the decision. And we hope today to learn more about the consequences of the High Representative's decision, and also how we can more effectively resist these decisions, ignoring the European Court of Human Rights decisions and entrenching ethnic divisions. Perhaps by appealing to European Parliament. We'll see how what our panelists suggest. Our esteemed panelists today include Bojan, Šošić, Azra Zornić, and Tineke Strik. I'll give each one, I'll introduce each person now before we begin in the order of Bojan, Azra, and then Tineke. So first, Bojan Šošić is a psychologist and a member of the presidency of the Association of KRUG 99, the Independent Intellectual Association in Sarajevo, founded during the siege. And Bojan is also a prominent human rights activist in Bosnia. Azra Zornić is also a civil activist, retired sociology professor, and is a member of the Association of Independent Intellectuals, KRUG 99, and is also known to us as a successful plaintiff before the European Court of Human Rights, and has inspired a generation with her activism. And Tineke Strik is a member of the European Parliament for the Dutch Greens since July 2019. From 2007 to 2019, she was a member of the Senate for the Dutch Greens. During that period, she represented the Dutch Parliament in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, where she was active as a rapporteur for the Committee on Migration, as well as the Committee on Legal Affairs. Prior to her election as a member of Parliament, European Parliament, she worked as an associate professor in migration law, focusing on the rights of third country nationals, especially the right to family unification, border policies, and the external dimension of EU migration policy. Against this background, her focus in the European Parliament is on migration and asylum policies, specifically their compliance with human rights. And in this vein, she's a member of Libe, AFET, and DROIT committees. In the Libe committee, she's a co-coordinator for the Greens EFA group and rapporteur on the recast returns directive. I wanted to add that Ms. Strik has been an indispensable friend of Bosnia for years, and 1 year ago, on a visit to Bosnia, she emphasized that the European Union should be stricter towards the provocations of members of the presidency of BiH, Milorad Dodik, and not reward him, which is why she called for financial sanctions against Dodik in order to protect the integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And in July, Tineke met with Bojan and Azra and I at the Memorial Center to discuss our proposal to bring international judges back to Bosnia in order to prosecute, among other things, genocide denial. So we want to express our appreciation for her support and of Bosnia, or support for Bosnia, and for her time today. So thank you very much again to everyone, and I invite Bojan Šošić to begin.
Thank you. So I'd like to start on a rather personal note to share some information that is from within the process to some degree, one might say, and that is to give you some insight into the meeting, the only meeting that Azra and myself have had with Mr. Schmidt so far, which was just before the October 2nd and the imposition of the changes to the election law. So after the protests that Professor Pettigrew mentioned that we called for in late July to oppose what was announced, and all we knew about the proposed changes that the OHR was allegedly planning to introduce in terms of the election process had to do with demographics, had that syntagm of those notorious 3% threshold, which was something that we considered would be absolutely unacceptable. And we considered that we must oppose that openly. So in the end, as you all recall, after, of course, the decision was postponed, and the OHR invited a delegation from KRUG 99 to meet Mr. Schmidt in the last week of September. And the delegation consisted of, I think, 6 of us, and those 6 included Mrs. Zornić and myself. When we discussed our, it was an interesting, we could say relatively long meeting, in which we discussed primarily our vision, our views of what Bosnia is and what it should be like, and what principles we stand for, and the need to actually implement the judgments of the European Court for Human Rights, which is sort of a red line that we deem should never be put to compromise of a sort. And at that point, my general impression of what we could hear from Mr. Schmidt is that he tried very hard to persuade us that he is highly informed about all things Bosnia, meaning its history. Apart from several instances when he mentioned meeting prominent personalities from the political past of this country, including during the war itself, when he also said he traveled and visited Bihać, for instance, and not only Bosnia, but also some other prominent politicians from the region, like Ibrahim Rugova from Kosovo, and so on, mentioning that he has read Andrić and so on. But my overall impression after all of this brought me back to an old concept that I accepted as my own, of a difference between being informed, being knowledgeable, and being wise. So it's relatively easy to have lots of information about a particular subject, but to have it systematically arranged, to have it clear, clarified, checked, and all fitting together, that would be knowledge. And once you couple that knowledge with a particular set of values, then we might call that wisdom. And that was my general impression. Mr. Schmidt is very much informed about things in Bosnia, but I did not see knowledge. And from all we can see so far, it's also far from wisdom. Because he obviously insisted on certain principles, on certain values that he advocated for. He justified the imposition of these amendments by his motive to put a stop on various mechanisms of blocking the functioning of a single of the two entities in Bosnia, which in itself, of course, is something that we might question. But we can so far see that it's also questionable whether that is successful at all, namely certain mechanisms of blocking or possibly blocking the functioning of the federation not only remain, but have merely shifted. They were introduced in some other places. So it's like, you know, you have a leaky ship, and then you try to put your finger in some of the places, and then the water comes in from some other places, meaning that some of the fundamental problems have not been resolved. To us, it was a bit of a surprise, because we were aware that some changes will be introduced. They will be imposed. Even during that meeting, he did not deny his plan to do so. However, we were not acquainted with the actual contents of the decision that he will make. And I remember actually being on one of the TV stations in Sarajevo for a live broadcast when I was part of a group of analysts that they invited to comment the oncoming election results in the evening after the elections. And I was struck, of course, as everyone else, was that he actually imposed the decision on that very day, on that very evening. It did not come as a surprise, and they asked me straight away on TV to comment on that. I say, I understand why he did that now, because we said anything prior would be clearly meddling in the process itself. It would be an international precedent, because you don't do that. You don't change the rules of the game just so in such a short period of time before the actual elections. And had he done so even a day after or any time after the elections, anyone could say, oh, his decision was under the influence of the actual election results. This way he tried to avoid that and to say, okay, we just do this day. He was obviously led by some motive to be active, to not sit idly, as opposed to what we have witnessed from Valentin Inzko prior to him in the seat of the High Representative. But of course, many questions remained open. And one of those was the question that I asked him during our meeting in the week before. And this is something that we always insist on, and has much to do also with what Professor Pettigrew mentioned in his introductory note, and that is the negation, the denial of genocide and war crimes. because the decision that Valentin Inzko left us with, that he concluded his term as High Representative, was to introduce the changes, the amendments to the criminal code, which introduced sanctions against those who would deny genocide and glorify war criminals. And from what we could see now is that this has not been in reality implemented. Not a single indictment was made in the meantime, even though some prominent political figures, including one of Dodik's assistants, denied genocide in public. So, and then they said, the prosecution said that there was no intention on his behalf to put anyone into inconvenience, and that he basically didn't mean it. That was their message, which of course is ridiculous. And the situation we have now is the coalitions, the post-election coalitions that are packed with people from, we say, blacklists, people under sanctions from the US and UK authorities. And what happened is that we have in place now talks about the future of this country, which are led mostly by people who are sanctioned by foreign governments, but not our own. So this is something that the OHR itself chose to ignore. So I believe that what we'll have in place in the future will be further denial of genocide and glorification of war criminals, and there will still be various mechanisms of blocking the government in place on so many levels. Of course, we could go into details. There have been various analyses, but I think the most important thing by which we can evaluate the actual imposed decision of the High Representative is the situation we have now, meaning that it's easiest to know the tree by looking at its fruit. And this is the situation that we have now, which is, I would say, even more of a crisis than we had in the last year and a half. So it's a rather broad overview I tried to give you. It's rather abstract. I didn't give much attention to particular details, and it's gloomy, but this is what I would like to say on this matter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your introductory comments, Bojan. I will pass the baton to Azra for her comments.
Thank you, David. The High Representative violated both domestic and international laws, provisions, and norms when, on the night of the election, while the counting of votes was still going on, he imposed discriminatory amendments on the constitution of the FBH entity and the election law, which even went beyond the scope of his competencies, which he has in accordance with the Annex 10 of DPA. With the imposed amendments, he permanently secured participation in government at all levels for a group of people gathered around HDZ, thereby derogating from the European Court of Human Rights itself. Hypocritical right-wing Europe remained deaf and dumb to all this. Now we have a new expression for these actions. We call it Schmidtism. At the same time, both Europe and USA, which was the symbol of democracy in the whole world, betrayed their own idea of democracy by supporting the High Rep in imposing undemocratic and discriminatory laws. The malignity of Schmidt's decisions for democracy itself in a system of unequal value of the vote, where the government is drawn from a hat, is evil for the BH state and for all its citizens, regardless of the ethnicity. There is no democracy without a citizen. It has never existed anywhere, and more civil rights mean more collective ethnic rights. The consequences of such an act are malicious and permanent. The High Rep's justification that he unblocked the processes in the formation and work of the executive and legislative authorities with amendments is absolutely incorrect. However, here we are talking about fraud and betrayal of civic Bosnia and Herzegovina by the international community in its entirety. On the contrary, by increasing the number of delegates in the House of Peoples, he enabled both the HDZ and the SNSD to block processes and blackmail their unblocking if their demands and wishes are not met. From the foregoing conclusion that the High Rep set back democracy in BH actually returned us to the Middle Age and introduced us to feudal apartheid, deepened segregation and division, and cancelled all democratic achievements in the last 30 years. If there are the democratic norms that are applied in Europe and the world, then the citizens of BH are right to ask whether we want membership in such hypocritical right-wing Europe. What good Europe does the membership, that is candidate status, in which we can remain for all eternity, bring us? Europe hypocritically offers us loans through various funds and projects, which actually lead us into a lifelong debt slavery. All the activities of High Rep and Europe itself contribute to the fact that the interest of Europe is not the inclusion of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but its division into Greater Serbia and Croatia. Therefore, the citizens of BH are determined to demand a referendum of whether BH should be a member of such a hypocritical right-wing Europe or not. Thank you. That's it. That's all so far.
Thanks so much, Azra, for your introductory comments. Trenchant remarks, important and challenging questions. And now we will appropriately pass the baton to Ms. Strik.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, and everyone for organizing this meeting, and also for your first introductions, Bojan and Azra. My criticisms with Schmidt's election law focuses actually on two main aspects: the procedure and also the content of the proposals. As was already mentioned, in terms of procedure, the imposition of these changes on election law was really an unacceptable move, of course. You don't have to be an electoral expert to see that it's unfair to change the system of elections right after the votes have been cast. And I understand what Bojan said, that it may have been perceived as a right balance between changing it before and after. But I think that the OSCE guidelines are very clear that you should not change the electoral rules at the last moment, because it has a potential to undermine the electoral process and diminish the opportunity for political participants and voters to know what the rules are and also what the impact would be. And I think even though it was imposed after people had cast their votes, the impact of their votes really changed due to this imposition of the rules. And I think that because I also had a meeting, a very extended meeting with him in June, when we heard about the proposals that he wanted to impose. And there, in part of the proposals that he had, I was supportive to, so making it more easy for judges to be elected, presidents of the federation to be elected, integrity rules to be enhanced, but also said to him, look, go ahead with these rules because they are more technical, and people can only benefit from it, but stay away from the electoral law. On the one hand, because you need to implement then the whole case law of the European Court of Human Rights. He's not able to do so. So leave that to the politicians for the moment. And there, I think what was very important that he expressed his pessimism that the politicians would stay in a deadlock and so on. But I said you need to give time for newly elected politicians to resolve the problems, to resolve the outstanding problems. And the way he did it, the timing that he did, was he didn't give any chance to those who were just newly elected to find an agreement among themselves and to overcome certain conflicts or deadlocks. So this timing was very bad and has certainly increased the distrust of citizens into the whole interference with the national systems. And this is really very, very regrettable. And it may even, benefit the Dodics and so on, who are critical to the whole institute, of course, of OHR. Then also, if you look at the content, I already said that specifically this electoral system was a very bad proposal. It further entrenched ethnic division and it undermines the one man, one vote principle. And I think what I had a talk not so long ago with Professor Marco from Graz. He's more also on the constitutional law. And he said it took him a few days to find out exactly what it meant for the seat. So it's a very complicated system also. But his conclusion was also that the law will lead or further gerrymandering specifically for big parties. So not only on ethnic, but also, of course, but also the big parties. And this is, I think, also an undemocratic move. And furthermore, I think with what was already said, this move means that the HDZ, who was actually the one causing this deadlock the year before, is now being rewarded with this unreasonable demands and with hijacking this process. And I'm very afraid that there's now little incentives left for HDZ to participate in any future negotiations, and specifically also the constitutional change that we need HDZ for as well. So in that sense also, I really think it's a hugely destructive amendment, because the whole idea, what in my view, of trying to get the election law changed was that the purpose would be achieved, namely of changing the constitution and implementing the case law of the European Court of Human Rights. Now that only Ljubich has been implemented means that the HDZ doesn't have any benefit anymore, any interest in having this constitutional amendment being completed. And also this rewarding behavior of the threats and blackmail and uncooperative attitude, I think it also, you know, is a continuation of the constant appeasement policies of international community towards different parties in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it's actually also giving a very wrong signal, of course, to other parties, like, okay, if you behave yourself destructively and you put only your demands at the fore, then you will be rewarded. And I think this will only create even more the domestic political problems and high demands and no preparedness of coming up with compromises to find a common solution. And I don't know if you know, because also this whole narrative of this idea that Schmidt had to do that in order to prevent the collapse of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this was, again, I don't know if you know this, it was published only last week of Paul Taylor. He's a senior fellow at Friends of Europe, and he gives a summary of all the things at stake now in the Western Balkans. And he simply says it, like, he heard through the grapevines that this election law has prevented Bosnia-Herzegovina from a complete collapse, because if that would not have happened, the HDZ and the Croatian Bosnians would have withdrawn from the state level, and that would have been followed by Dodik's succession, and then we would not have any Bosnia at all. So I find this so strange and so unacceptable that this narrative is now being promoted and pushed for, and no one, there's little attention for the future blockades that it actually leads to more ethnic segregation, less possibilities for more civic states where everyone's rights are weighing equally heavy. So apart from the detrimental and long-term impact on the political climate on on Bosnia, I think it's still, we still see other threats that are still being rewarded. If you look at Dodik's position, which is also very present, of course, we see that OHR is now thinking of imposing a law on state property, which would, of course, appease the interest of Dodik. And Commissioner Varela just sent in to the European Parliament a summary of the visits that he did a few weeks ago in Bosnia. And one of the things was what he mentioned was that he talked with Schmidt also on state property, and he talked with Dodik as well. So I also have the feeling there that Commissioner Varela also plays a very negative role and even promotes OHR's position, although the EU, EAS and Borrell were really surprised negatively by the first imposition in October by OHR. So there you also see the different bilateral or different national interests. I think that Farrelly is really serving the interest of, let's say, Hungary and also Croatia, where other EU actors, or at least national actors, are much more critical. And this paralyzes the EU and gives more leeway for the US and UK to pursue their views. I have the feeling. So, yeah, what to do now? I think it's for us, it's difficult to hold Schmidt to account, as the only institution that OHR is accountable to is the Peace Implementation Council, of course. Schmidt has been very silent and hiding from any democratic debate ever since his decision. But I think that what we saw in July, also the huge demonstrations and the huge pressure that NGOs and Bosnian citizens put, really had worked at that time, at least, because he refrained for a while from imposing from imposing that electoral law at that day. So maybe still, I think that we should continue the pressure also from civil society. What I did from the European Parliament is that I gathered a coalition of 27 parliamentarians from European, German, French, and Dutch parliaments. We sent a letter to the OHR demanding an explanation. And but we sent the letter mid-October. We still did not get any answer from him. We demanded him to come at an AFET committee in the European Parliament. He accepted that invitation, but just a few days before that date, he canceled this meeting. With the argument that it would be one day before the Constitutional Court decision, and that he would think it would not be proper to express his views just before. So what we are now doing is putting pressure to make sure that he will come, because he cannot escape from and not justifying his decisions. And at the same time, we have to wait, I think, what the Constitutional Court will say. It has now postponed the adoption of a decision on the merits. So we have to see how the court will interpret it. Yeah, make sure that that also other voices are heard. He seems to rely specifically on the UK and US. And I think it's very important that the other voices are coming through more and more strongly, and also that we more strongly also keep on opposing this whole appeasement politics. I already mentioned Dodik and the state property laws that may be imposed as well. We also heard very lately that Farrelly will resume, most probably, the granting of 600 million euros to Dodik, which was suspended due to his threat of succession. And I've also now written a letter, and I got the support from all the political groups to send it, urging von der Leyen as president of the Commission to block this, because we should not go into this direction. And yeah, maybe we should try to see what coalition we can gather, also with members from national parliaments, with civil society in Bosnia, and maybe also, yeah, bring more light to the Citizens' Assembly that came up with a lot of very good recommendations. I think, you know, going away from this whole ethnically based policies, rules, but really new, fresh ideas from which direction to go for the future. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tineke, for those informative and important comments. I wanted to you know, open to questions that, you know, each of our panelists could answer. Say if there's one question, each of the panelists, anyone who's interested could answer it. And also if Azra and Bojan had any follow-up comments that they wanted to make, that would also be, just let me know and raise your hand. If anyone has a question who's participating, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. One question I was going to pose, just to start off the question period, would be something that Tineke mentioned, which was the Constitutional Court. She mentioned that Mr. Schmidt canceled his meeting. That would have been the day before the Constitutional Court hearing. But so one question I have is, does the Constitutional Court of BIH actually have the ability to overturn the law? Do they have standing to overturn the law? We know that they recently declined to make any sort of emergency ruling on the law and postponed their decision. But I wondered if we could clarify what they could actually do, and then if you think it's worthwhile to make an effort to protest the law in an effort to try to overturn the law through citizens groups, or if we should shift our attention elsewhere. So that would be for all three panelists.
If I don't know if Bojan or Azra want to say anything, but what I know, but maybe you know much better than me, because this was also a question I asked to Professor Marco, like, what can the Constitutional Court do? His view was that the Constitutional Court is competent if the OHR agrees with that. So if that it's still depending on the agreement of OHR, because as a rule, the OHR governs on the basis of Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. So he has to give permission, so to say, for reviewing of the decisions by a national or international court. But I'm not sure if you concur with that or not. And this is then something very important, of course, to ask the OHR if we would then indeed approve that.
Yeah. From what I know, there have been cases. I'm trying to look up. There was an article explaining the cases in which the Constitutional Court overruled or overturned the decisions of the High Representative. I think it was at the time of Paddy Ashdown, but I don't remember the exact decision that was the center of this either particular instance or whether there were several of them. I'm not sure, but we could check it up. Anyway, it is quite clear that this is a very tricky political situation, and that the court itself will not want to meddle too much in this situation, and that they are most probably trying to look for the most elegant way to get out of not being under too much pressure. And at the same time, it was very indicative that the political parties, primarily HDZ and the so-called Eight, have been most active in reaching agreements, no matter how unfounded they may be, or full of floscules and general points so far away from any concrete decisions or direction that they may turn to. So the public now has a perception that and an impression that it's all chasing after seats, that they're running after places in or chairs in the future government on various levels. The same is what we have at the moment. Also, them doing the same with Dodik, namely securing seats in the national government, that is the Council of Ministers, while at the same time we do not see that any particular principle that we would like to see advocated for is actually being put first before any of these games that they are currently playing. So it appears that they are actually quite ready to even gamble away our perspective of nearing or being integrated into NATO alliance, which is weird, to say the least, given that we actually have a law that obliges our leaders to move in that direction. But it seems at the moment that there's a sort of a compromise reached in the latest meeting with Dodik to abandon that course. Given all these signals, it's quite understandable that the Constitutional Court will find it rather meaningless to make a ruling on the imposed decisions when we are now being faced with a done deal, since they have been so fast in reaching these agreements, quite probably to the detriment of the citizens of this country.
Thank you. Azra, I wondered if you had a comment on the capacity or role of the Constitutional Court.
Just to be short, definitely CCBH has competence to discuss and make rulings about everything that is connected to the Constitution, because he is above all laws, all authorities in BH when it comes to the Constitution. So, as Bojan said, this became more political than legal matter. If it was just a legal matter, they would sit and discuss and make rules about it. But obviously they are waiting for signs and approvals from the political parties, because the judges of the Constitutional Court are coming, are chosen by the parties, political parties. Two of them coming from Republika Srpska and are chosen at their assembly. So the leading party was SNSD. So it's not difficult to conclude what does it mean. The same is with federation with 4 others. So they are all independent in a way, but in reality, they are not independent.
Okay, Thank you very much. I don't see a question in the chat, so I was going to ask another question. I believe, Patrick, can we go 5 minutes over our time? If we need a little extra time.
Yeah, that would be great, David, if
If-
people are able to stay.
If people
Thank
are
you.
able to stay. So a follow-up question is something that came to me when I was speaking for KRUG 99 2 weeks ago. One of the comments from the members who were present was, well, it was almost a sense of betrayal by the United States in terms of this passage of the election law. And so the question is something like, why was the U.S. supporting this implementation all along? It's as though if we go back to, I believe, about a year ago when they were having meetings in Neum, and it seemed like this was all being arranged by Mr. Palmer, Mr. Escobar, and remember the reports coming out of Arhaley's meetings from Mr. Sattler. So why has the U.S. been behind this change, in the form of this change, from the beginning? I think the EU distanced itself in a statement from the actual decision, but the U.S. has just supported this. So I'm wondering, in a sense, I'm trying to understand that, so that we could, because I remember Azra asked me, would another letter to Secretary Blinken help? I mean, how would we effectively approach the U.S. position on this? And you can answer that. Any of the panelists weigh in on that, or I don't know if we want to start with Tineke again, or
Yeah, indeed, it's true. I mean, last year, US and EU were very much teaming together in trying to get a deal. But on this, there's really a separation. It's really US. And yeah, for me, it's also a little bit guessing why they did so. Maybe on the one hand, they used the narrative that I just mentioned, that it was necessary to rescue Bosnia, so to say. But I think underlying that it's very clear that they served the interest of Croatia. And why they did that, I mean, Croatia and the US are very much on the same line. I don't know what all the interest lying behind this, but I think it was very clear. And this was also why Croatia, of course, all of a sudden stayed pretty silent along this process of imposition of the law, and was the first one to applaud the whole decision, of course. Although you can now see that this appeasement is not effective at all, because now the Croatians start to become demanding again. So because it seems to work. So I think this plays a huge role. And I think if you look at the electoral law system imposed, it has similarities with the US system as well, of course. So they may not see a huge problem in that. And I think that they have prioritized the more geopolitical considerations of regional stability, et cetera, over the interest of citizens and real democratic changes. And this is, I think, that you can really accuse the US of, but this is my take on why they took this position. But it's also a bit hypocritical, because towards Dodik, they were always very strong and taking, they sanctioned him, and they made very clear appeasing doesn't work. But now with Croatia and with HDZ, they actually did the opposite. So I find that a very remarkable move, and they should also be held accountable, of course, for this policy.
Thank you.
I agree fully, and it is hypocritical. And also what we have to note is that in the long run, all these instances of appeasement serve the interests of Russia in the Western Balkans, which is ridiculous that this course of action is being backed or even orchestrated by prominent members of the administration in the US at the moment. It is downright ridiculous and very hard to explain whether they have been under the influence or having some connections with either from family ties or business ties that we to some degree are acquainted of. But in the long run, it's hard to see that this will bring any good in any reflection about the role of the US or even Brussels, I'm sorry to say, when it comes to the current situation in Bosnia, given that this particular politics that was served, that was appeased at the moment, but far from, as you said, being fed fully so that they would actually stop demanding, it's far from that, is the fact that this politics is a direct continuation of the politics that was ruled to be a joint criminal enterprise during the war. So this is what Zagreb has done during the war, and it is the same thing now. So we have, on one hand, Serbian politics that led to genocide in Srebrenica, and we have what Zagreb has been doing, and obviously is doing still in some way. It is very much related to what was ruled at some point to have been joint criminal enterprise. So this is really a ridiculous position, and I doubt that history will look favorably at that. Although, I mean, it's our lives, so we have a right not to care much about history. We want things to be better now.
Thank you. Azra, did you have a comment on this?
Yeah, the approach of the international community towards BH is opportunistically and pragmatic, while looking for the easiest solution for them. Under the influence of our predators, Croatia and Serbia, the international community is dragging BH into Palestinization of the country and its citizens. The electoral changes as such are not sufficient without full implementation of the human rights court verdicts. In other words, without adoption of the civic constitution. We all must keep in mind that peaceful Bosnia and Herzegovina means peaceful Balkan, and the peaceful Balkan means peaceful Europe. Otherwise, you could imagine what could happen to the world.
Well, that seemed like a poignant moment on which to conclude our conversation today. Although I did want to ask Tineke if she could suggest something we might do as a group and a broader coalition in the United States to appeal to the European Union to block the 600 million euros that Varhelyi wants to grant to Dodik, to Republika Srpska. Did I understand that?
Yes, exactly, David. I mean, Dodik, we heard Dodik say that, saying very proudly that Varhelyi had promised that to him. And I confronted Varhelyi with that, asking, is that true? He didn't deny it. And when I asked who is the person to decide this, he said, it's the commission, so it's me. So, by not denying it and saying it's his decision, I'm pretty sure that he will do that. He has made this promise to Dodik. So what I could do is forward the letter that we are now going to send to Van der Leyen to you also, to see if you could echo this message also to Van der Leyen. I think it's important to have as more people as possible behind this call. And maybe afterwards, maybe for the more long term, indeed, we could see what we could do more as a coalition in order to make sure that the OHR does not, go only further and further with this destructive strategy of him.
So that,
Because
that's,
also to show that there are also in US and UK, there are politicians who really care for the citizens and who really do not completely concur with the national strategy. So that might be a good way forward.
and I wonder, well, I look forward to seeing the letter that you already wrote, because it sounds like he's possibly trying to circumvent the sanctions that are in place. Well, I imagine you referenced those. So that would be an important way forward. So I don't see, I'm looking at the chat now to see if we have any other questions. I don't see other questions. So I think I'm wondering, Patrick, would you like to bring things to a close?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for a very excellent discussion today. I am very hopeful, based on Tineke's suggestion at the end, that we think about a coalition for effective opposition, especially in the case that this might be High Representative Schmidt's testing the waters for further action. I think that's, even if we can't stop this in the short term, we need to think about the long-term implications, both procedurally, as you said, and also the content of the actions. That might be the basis for the Constitutional Court to rule only on procedural grounds, but I think it's important that we're informed and that we take effective action as a group. So thank you again for a really excellent discussion.
Thanks finally to Bojan, Azra, and Tineke, and to everyone for attending.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks again.
Thanks a lot, and good luck in Bosnia also.
Yes.
Bye.
Thank you, Tineke, and thank to everyone else, but especially Tineke. She is doing a lot for Bosnia.
Yes.
And thank you very much.
We agree.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the things that you do. It's much more easy from Brussels than really in this grim climate in Bosnia. So I admire your persistence, really.
Thank you.
I mentioned this panel today to someone, and they said, okay, please give our best to Mrs. Strik from citizens of Bosnia.
That's very, very kind. Okay, thanks, and let's stay in touch.
Thank you. And we'll make this recording available for those
Okay.
who were not able to join. So within a few days, we should have a shareable link that you can feel free to distribute to others who might be interested in joining a coalition of response.
Great. Thanks a lot. Enjoy
Thank
the
you
Sunday
again.
evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
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 Take care. So